Well, the special meeting of Faculty Senate will come to order. Welcome, everyone. It looks like we have a quorum. And before we launch into the agenda, I'd like to cover some processes and procedures that should help the meeting run smoothly. So first, I am requesting that senators and attendees identify themselves with their first and last names in Zoom. And I'm asking this because if we were in person, then we'd all be able to see each other. We'd all be able to identify one another. And I'd like to replicate that experience in this space. So to change your name, click on the three dots that appear next to the existing name on the screen, and you should see that option to change your name. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, I would sincerely appreciate it. Next, senators, in my initial email announcement about this meeting, I provided some directions on voting and asking questions or generally communicating in Zoom. After each presenter, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So to ask those questions or to provide a comment, you can use the audio feature or you can use the chat feature. If you'd like to use the audio feature, please raise your hand and you'll be placed in a queue, and then we'll call on you. And once we call on you, you can make your comments or your questions. To raise your hand, click on the participants icon at the bottom of the screen, and you should see the option to raise your hand. So while the senators can use the chat feature, anyone who's an attendee or a non-senator cannot. But you can still make comments or ask questions. And you can do that using the Q&A feature, and that's also at the bottom of your screen. So you can pose any questions or comments there. And there are several folks who are being attentive to the Q&A and the chat, and so we'll try to get as many questions answered as possible during the meeting today. So in an effort to keep the meeting running smoothly and to prevent Zoom fatigue, I'm also instituting a time limit on the question and answer period for the president, the provost, and the vice president for strategic initiatives. So the question and answer period will, I'm sorry? Okay, so question and answer period will be kept to a maximum of 20 minutes per speaker. And this is for senators. When we get to voting, we'll be voting on one for approval item, and rather than doing a voice vote, we'll also be using the hand raise feature for that. And then finally, senators and panelists, if you're not speaking, be sure to mute your microphone. Okay, with that said, we're on to our first order of business, the approval of the minutes for our June 8th meeting. The June 8th meeting minutes have been distributed as an annex to your agenda. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes from the June meeting? Okay, hearing no corrections, the minutes from the June meeting are approved as written. Next on our agenda, we have President Gee, so we'll hear a report from him. So President Gee, I'm inviting you to present and speak now.
He has been trying to join. I have not seen him yet. As soon as he joins, we'll put him on here.
And somebody had mentioned that they don't see Provost Reed yet. Is that true? Also?
I haven't seen her either, and they do have the invite.
Okay. So while we are waiting for Provost Reed and President Gee, I suppose we could move on to our budget presentation. So move backwards. Is that okay with you? Are you comfortable with that, Rob? So we'll just kind of backtrack. So we'll start with you, and then as soon as they get here,
Of course, and if they get here and you want me to pause and go back and hear from Dr. Gee first, or however you want to handle it, just let me know and we'll take off.
So I see the president has just joined.
Excellent.
So let's start with him.
Yeah.
There you are.
Great. Hi. I'm sorry. I'm totally incompetent. Would you please would you please accept that as a reality? And then I apologize, but I couldn't get in, as a matter of fact. So I think Rob is just starting. So I'll just be very quick. First of all, I appreciate the fact that everyone's able to join us. I don't know how many are on, but I assume that there are a number of people, and I appreciate that. And in addition to our senators, as you know, we have had, we have quite a journey. I think if someone would have asked me 3 months ago, I said, well, by now we'll have all the therapeutics, we'll have all the, at least have a vaccine that is going to be available. Well, we're in that keyhole moment where both therapeutics and vaccines are coming, but we still have this pandemic. And of course, it continues to ravage all across this country. And we had a real spike in Morgantown. About 2 weeks ago, Rob and I, along with our board chair, David Alvarez, went and visited with the governor and told him that we wanted to really have, that we had a reopening strategy, but we wanted to make certain that he understood what it was, and we needed to have his support. He gave it, but he had this caution, which is that we need to make certain that we are doing this safely, and that we are mindful of the fact that we have faculty, staff, and students, as well as a community in which we reside. And in addition, he made what I think was a very brave move, and that was he determined that we would move to mandatory masks in buildings and close the bars, and the net result is the fact that we've gone from about 400 cases down to about, I saw it was 148 just a minute ago. Still, though, we're very concerned about whether or not, when we brought everyone back, that the spread would become overpowering. Even though, and you'll hear this, we have a number of protocols in place to deal with the issue. So we have moved not away from opening, but to this pivot, and I think that is an important move for all of us, and that's exactly what we want to talk about today. The way that I view the world is pretty simple. We have this thing called a pandemic, and it continues to be very problematic. We had this other thing, this other pandemic, which is called the collateral damage. If you read everything, read all the studies that are ongoing, suicides are way up. I just got a note from a father last week whose son committed suicide, a freshman, one of our freshmen. He said, I called him and talked to him. He said he died of loneliness. He said he would much rather had him die of the coronavirus than the way that he did, which is that he shot himself. What a terrible thing to do. But suicides are way up. Drug abuse is way up. In this cohort that we're dealing with, we have a significant public health problem. And so we're trying to balance that and still at the same time make certain that we are cognizant of what our faculty and our staff face in terms of the virus itself. I've made a determination. I'm teaching a freshman course in person, and because I feel very confident in the protocols that we put in place. And this is not a captain going down with the ship, as I told someone, but rather it is really a privilege for me to be able to do that, and I'm looking forward to it. So that's where we are. I have great confidence in what we're doing. I appreciate the support of our governor and what he's done to support the institution. But this is like threading a needle, and we'll continue to do so. I wish we could be in a normal circumstance. No one would like to have that more than me. But on the other hand, we have the responsibility to our families and to our community, as well as to our university family. So saying that, Natalie, I really want to turn it back to you. And by the way, I'm going to have to leave around 10 to 4 for a few minutes. I'm going on another public broadcasting program, and then I'll be back after that.
Are there any questions for the president? Questions or general comments? And remember, senators, you can raise your hand and speak.
I can't see anyone.
I know, yeah. Or you can post a question in the chat. Vice President can answer questions together.
So, Natalie, thank you, and thanks to the Faculty Senate for having me. I know that it's been a stressful time, and as we'll go through the presentation today, you'll see that we actually made some pretty good progress given where things could have gone for the spring with COVID. And so I do want to say thank you to everybody from the university community once we got into the middle of this pandemic for what we all did together to try to come out from a financial perspective in a stronger position than we could have. And I also know this is just a time of general stress with everything that's going on. So thank you for all your hard work and all you do for the university. We're all moving forward together. We don't know all the answers to the playbook. Sometimes we don't know the questions, but we're moving forward, I think, together collectively. So if you saw the presentation that I gave in January, I'm going to peg some of the information that I provide to you today off of that. If you've seen it, I'll move quickly through the summary, but if you haven't, I'll try to give enough detail to give some context. So today I'm going to talk about the university's budget, sort of its big picture structure, talk about fiscal year 20 and how we ended that as an institution, and then walk through fiscal year 2021 and where we thought we would be through the lens of January of 2020 and where we are now through the COVID lens of July of 2020. So let me try to share my screen. Okay, it looks like it's working. So is it, Gordon, Marianne, can you see, is my screen, am I sharing? Okay.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Okay, so one of the things we talked about back in January was the university's budget, and just from a big picture perspective, as you can see, we're about $1 billion in total revenues. We are just about $1 billion in total expense. And as everyone knows, in FY 2016, or as we've talked about before, I should say, you know, we had tuition that came in lower than expected, and we had some capital expenses that were a little bit more than expected. And our discounting for our students from a tuition perspective, we ended the year with a negative $24 million operating margin, which was around negative 2.4%. And so for fiscal years 2017 through 2017 was a year of a number of significant cuts and trying to get us back to a balance, which we achieved in 2018. If you look at 2019, we had an adjusted operating margin of just around $4 million or 0.36%. So the big takeaway we talked about in January is that on $1 billion budget, we operate on really thin margins for the university, and anything at the margins, 100 students or 150 students or just 1% of our supply spend can flip us from positive to negative. And our original budget for FY 2020 had us with a 400, and I'm sorry, I don't know why that's in, the yellow is positive. So a $412,000 positive margin at the beginning of FY 20 as we came into it. One of the things we talked about last time was our days of cash on hand. And as we were in January, we thought for the fiscal year, we would end with about 69 days cash on hand. As you can see in 2014, 2015, before we had our lean year in 16, we had around 80 days cash on hand. Most of our peers are 90 to 100 days cash on hand, and we'd like to get back up over a period of several years into that 75 to 80 range. But what we really needed to do from 2016 through 2018 was get back up into the mid-60s. The getting below 60 days cash on hand is really a place that an institution, any institution of higher education, but particularly an institution of our size, we don't want to drop below. And you can see all the great work that the university did in 2019. We gained 10 days cash on hand, which is really significant, and back up around 70 days. In January, we thought we'd hold steady for this fiscal year and hold at about 69 days cash on hand before COVID hit. So our COVID-19 world for FY20, we were really fearful that tuition and fees would drop off a cliff and we'd see about a 25% reduction in the amount of fees that we would collect. We didn't. So the good news on that is we came in only about 8% short of budget originally for FY20. And so that was a significant improvement over what we thought might happen given the pandemic. We did see a reduction in revenues from athletics and summer activities. And while our athletics department is expected to balance their own budget, they did see a decline in revenues during the last quarter when basketball tournaments were canceled. And it is a part of the overall financial picture for the institution. As a lot of you know, we run a lot of summer camps and a lot of summer activities at the university. That caused a decline in revenues of around $7 million. So from a revenue perspective, we were expecting a loss. On the positive side, we did see an infusion of revenues from the federal government, around $20 million. Half of that went to our students and half of that offset. All of it went to our students. Half of it went in terms of grants and new money, and half of it offset losses we had for refunds for housing and dining. As many of you, I'm sure, were aware, to try to save money, we did implement furloughs for those employees who would be made whole given the CARES Act unemployment plus benefits. I'm pleased to report that other than a few folks who decided to retire on their own, all of those employees are back at the university and working as of yesterday. We did see an increase in expenditures for ITS in preparing for the fall. And as Mary Ann mentioned, the Teaching and Learning Commons has been working on lighting up a lot more of our classrooms for the fall and working with ITS. We just moved our eCampus software from an on-campus solution, which had a lot of limitations, to the cloud. And so we should have a lot more bandwidth and flexibility and reliability for eCampus for the fall. And then again, this is my point of thank you. We did see a dramatic decrease in spend for supplies and services. I know I sent out a couple of memos asking you not to travel unless necessary, not to spend unless necessary, and everybody did it. And we came through in a much stronger financial position than we thought we might. Just as an example, we thought we ended fiscal year 19 with $116 million of operating cash. We thought that could be as low as $75 or $80 million at the end of this fiscal year, and those days cash on hand would drop into the 50s. So that didn't occur. So this is the days cash on hand, for actuals for FY 2020. So as of June 30th, 2020, you can see we projected 69 days cash on hand, we ended with 66. And so while we did lose some cash during the fourth quarter, as opposed to a significant drop in our cash, we held our own. And so I think that's something that we can all be proud of. We ended this fiscal year weathering the COVID storm that happened in the spring pretty well. And it sets us up for the fall to be able to navigate the ongoing pandemic. And so I again want to say thank you for what we did with FY 2020. So when we've talked about the 5-year financial plan and outlook, we usually talk about it on a 5-year basis. And as you may recall from January, one of the things we talked about is that all the hard work we've done in some budget cuts and working on retention, and I know that I think it was around 3% increase in retention last year, Mary Ann, that we saw, and working on persistence rates. Yeah. One of the things that we talked about as an institution, that if you think about a plan where we talk about 2.5% tuition increases every year, and we talk about maybe 100-person growth in first-time freshmen, and increasing those retention and persistence rates by 0.5% and 0.25%, over the next 5 years, when you look at the university's finances, you only see 1 year where our cash position is in the red, and everything else grows. And in fact, if you look at our accrual margin, when you get out to FY 23 and 24, you see some pretty healthy margins. And where we would like to get to as an institution, where we see those 2 and 3% positive margins, because then we have more money to invest in our faculty, in our staff, in new programs that our students want, and we continue to feed and invest in strategic priorities. And so coming into the pandemic, we saw that, given the future, that we had some opportunities to turn the corner as an institution. Now, we also talked, and I'll move through these quickly, that if we dropped enrollment, so if we had dropped 300 in our first-time freshmen over the next few years, that quickly flipped to where you went from positives in each over the 5 years to where we really get back into the point that sort of mirrors the past few years where we were sort of struggling. And so we talked quite a bit about how at the margins, those students, just 300 less first-time freshmen over a period of several years could make a difference. We also talked about how we're a tuition-driven institution at this point in time, given that our state appropriations only cover about 16% of our expenses. And so instead of a 2.5% tuition increase in each of the next 4 years, if we held tuition flat, you can see the impact that it would have on us as an institution. And so we talked about those 3 scenarios and the hope that in the future we'd be able to see some relatively modest growth in enrollment and balance lower tuition increases as we seek for a greater financial health. So our FY21 budget assumptions when we talked in January were first-time freshmen of 4,800 with a total enrollment of around 25,700. We had I apologize. So our original assumptions, let me go back here for FY21, was a 2.5% tuition increase, first-time freshmen of 4,950, and modest growth in grants and revenues. So as we move forward to now, the budget that our board just passed, we're projecting a first-time freshman of 4,800 as opposed to 4,960, so down about 160 freshmen. As opposed to a 2.5% growth in tuition, we kept tuition flat, and that was about $12 million. A slight increase to grants and contracts revenue, and I want to give a shout out to all of our researchers. Our research growth from a grants perspective has grown dramatically as you have been more successful in getting grants and in getting larger grants for the university. We've projected a 5% reduction in other revenues, and then we've put into the budget $10 million in COVID-related expenditures. We are hoping that at least 5 million of those, if not more, gets reimbursed. But for purposes of this budget, we assumed 4.9 million in unreimbursed COVID expenditures. So those are the basic assumptions that we put into the FY21 budget. So again, as opposed to January when we were talking about a tuition increase, now there's no tuition increase and enrollment is slightly off from where it was last year. Again, some reduction in revenues from a lack of summer classes and some increased costs for COVID. So when you look at the FY21 budget, and I know there's a lot of numbers on here, but I'll walk through it quickly. In January, we thought we would collect $415 million in tuition and fee revenue. Now, since we did not do a tuition increase, that's a decrease of around $12 million in revenue, plus a slight decline in enrollment for an additional $2 million off of projections. So we think we're going to collect around $14 million less in tuition than we did pre-COVID. State appropriations, we think will hold flat. Grants and contracts, you can see we're now projecting an additional $12.5 million more than we thought in January. Our auxiliary fees, we do think will decline given some of the decline in enrollment. Other revenues, including athletics, we think will be down significantly. And if you look at our total revenues, you can see that we're projecting $34.8 million less for the university than we thought in January. That's off the current budget that was approved back in June for our Board of Governors. So we had some work to do, and as a management team working with our deans and the provost office, we implemented around a 5% reduction in expenses for the units. And that came from primarily a reduction in travel, given the lingering impact of COVID, and in our supplies and services line. Each of our units believed that they could get to that 5% reduction for FY21's budget without any significant personnel reductions in terms of take-home pay or in layoffs. And so you can see in the bottom of the budget, after we go through the revenues at the top part, you can see where we've made those reductions. So for example, in FY21, in January, we thought our salary expense would be around $539 million. Now we think it'll be around $523. Part of that is the savings from furloughs. Part of that is not filling vacancies. And part of that is expected retirements and not replacements for vacancies that will come throughout the year. We saw a corresponding benefit reduction of around 3 million, and then we've cut our supplies by around 10 million. And you can see throughout where we actually have proposed reducing expenses compared to January by around $32 million. So the budget that has been approved by our Board of Governors right now has a positive $9 million margin. We think we'll grow our cash by around $2 million. That compares to what we talked about in January of a positive $11 million margin for the university at that point in time, and around a $12 million growth in cash. So at this point, you know, we feel comfortable with where the budget is. We know that these reductions won't be easy, but we think that we'll be able to manage them throughout the course of the year. We are hoping that, as President Gee mentioned, we get to some vaccinations and therapeutics towards January and February. At the latest, that we'll be back to a more normal operating situation, hopefully for the spring, but certainly by FY22, where some of these revenues will rebound. But those are the measures that we have proposed for the fall for the budget that the board approved in June. So one of the things that we've been asked pretty frequently is, well, what happens if revenues don't materialize? So what happens if by going to the phased approach, we see a drop in enrollment, or if state revenues crash and we see a big reduction in state appropriations? You know, what's that mean? I know all of you are thinking, what's that mean for my job? What's that mean for my take-home pay? What's that mean for all of us as an institution? And so let me first make this comment. We want to do everything we possibly can before we would impact anyone's pocketbook, before we would impact anyone's take-home pay. That's our last resort, and we don't have any plans for it or intentions to do it. We'll draw up some contingencies. But what I wanted to walk through you today is what happens if we did lose revenues? What will we think about as a leadership team in working with our university stakeholders is what might be a fair approach. So let me just walk through a quick scenario. So let's assume that enrollment drops for our freshmen and our grad students under this model just because we've had a COVID spike by around 4%. Let's also assume that our sophomores, juniors, and seniors say, you know what, it's online, we're gonna go somewhere else, or we're gonna take a gap year or a gap semester this fall, and our enrollment for our sophomores and juniors and seniors drops by 8% over what we're currently expecting. So that would mean a drop in revenues of around $26 million. Again, on a $1 billion budget, it's 2.6%, but it comes on top of other cuts in several years where we really had to maintain a tight budget. And so anything on the margins matters. So how would we look at something like that? Again, we would look at a number of measures before we would talk about broad pain or any type of, again, harming a wallet or a pocketbook, someone's take-home pay. We'd look at non-personnel related expenses. And so as we have de-densified for the campus for the fall, if there are supplies or other things that we would not need as much, we'll reduce those expenditures. If there's additional travel that we think we need to clamp down on to reduce for this fiscal year, that's one of the places that we would look. We'd look at whether there are additional vacancies and we need to hold on filling those to save money for this year. There are a whole string of issues that we might do. Someone asked me the other day whether we might consider a VSIP. Maybe. I mean, we would not be able to pay an entire year's salary for a VSIP, but could we do a shorter one for someone who was thinking about leaving the institution given the current environment? It might be an elegant way to save costs without spreading pain broadly. I know something President Gee has told us often is that, you know, spreading pain around like marmalade is not going to benefit the university long term. And we need to develop strategies that maximize our strengths, focus on our priorities, and help us move forward. So we would focus on personnel related actions again as a last resort. But let's just walk through a hypothetical. And again, this isn't something we're specifically planning on to implement. This is just a conversation about transparency and what the numbers might look like. So let's assume that $26 million reduction, that we were able to save $17 million in supplies and services and travel, and we still needed to reduce and save $9 million, and we decided we needed to do that from personnel And we decided we would do no layoffs for the institution. We do no furloughs, no temporary reductions in force, any of those things. How could we get to a number of that magnitude of 9 million? So if we were to say that we needed to spread the pain across the university, to have everybody ask everybody to sacrifice so that we could make it through the fiscal year given financial challenges, here's what would do the trick. So for our lower paid individuals, 0 to 50,000, I think as an institution and culturally, it would be tough to make them take a pay cut. And so let's just leave them off the table. For our completely grant funded individuals who are bringing in monies through those grants, we wouldn't make an adjustment either. So if we did a reduction effective October 1 for the rest of the fiscal year, and on July 1, everybody's salaries came back up, so this would be temporary. If we did a reduction of 3% for those making between 50 and 100,000, 4% for those 100 to 200,000, 5% 200 to 300,000, and 6% for 300,000 above, we'd hit that $9 million mark. It'd be temporary. It would come back to where it would be in July 1, and we would close that gap. And so while we would not look forward, and again, it would be a last resort, these are the types of ranges that we would be looking at for those types of reductions. Now, we would consider measures to ameliorate the nature of those reductions. And so while I know that faculty do not get annual leave, one of the things that we've talked about doing is, do we provide everybody the ability to take a floating holiday where they didn't have to work, or a half day? So that if you had a staff member who wanted to take a long weekend, or a faculty member that wanted to take a long weekend, normally under their contract, they wouldn't have the ability to sort of take that annual leave. But we would say, to make up for these reductions, it would essentially become an unpaid holiday. So we would give you something back in exchange for a belt tightening. The other thing we've looked at is whether we shut down the institution as of the 21st or 22nd of December and just keep the institution closed until the 3rd or 4th of January. Again, a nod that if we did ask folks to help make us through this financial situation, what is it that we could do to help ameliorate the situation? Again, these measures are of our last resort. We're going to be doing everything we can to avoid these. And before I turn it over for questions, I do want to say that if you look across the country, there were a number of institutions that as soon as COVID struck, they implemented another number of salary reductions and unpaid days off across the institution. Everybody was looking at a different financial picture, and they may very well have needed to do that. It was our belief that we could work together to reduce our supplies and reduce our travel and work together, that we decided not to go ahead and do those aggressive changes to impact financially individuals in a reduction of take-home pay. I'm really glad we decided to see how things would play out and move forward. We're going to take that cautious approach this fall to see where we need to go and work together as an institution moving forward. If we need to take these actions, I'll commit to you that we'll be transparent about it. You'll have a lot of notice and we'll work through it together. If we see those drops in revenues, I'm comfortable that we can work through this together without doing that. And just to sort of end it on a positive to that vein, the one thing I did not mention that I think will positively impact this situation are the discussions that are going on in Washington right now. So under the CARES Act back in, that was passed 2 or 3 months ago, there was a piece of that legislation, as I mentioned, that provided $14 billion worth of relief to higher education. WVU got $20 million out of that $14 billion, $14.6 billion to be precise. 10 of that we gave in grants to our students, and we were able to use 10 of that to offset revenue losses. The House of Representatives, when it passed the HEROES Act about a month ago, had a significant number for higher education, I think north of $50 billion. The Senate Republican leadership yesterday announced a piece of legislation where they were providing $30 billion for higher education. And so while we don't know the methodology for how those monies would be handed out, if you assume the Senate's starting position was $30 billion and the House of Representatives position was theirs, and they meet even at the Senate's position, there's a significant chance that the university would see between $30 to $40 million of federal assistance to help us navigate the fall. That would help pay for a lot of our IT costs. It would help pay for a number of things that we're working toward as an institution. And it certainly would help us in navigating any financial challenges we have as we look towards the fall. So over the next few weeks, we'll be monitoring what the federal government is doing. They've committed, I think, to collectively by mid-August to get it passed. And we will see how enrollment comes in mid-August. And after that point in time, we'll have a discussion as a leadership team with our board and our leadership and faculty and staff, and to come up with a plan as to how we can work through any financial challenges we have together. So again, thank you for all you do, for all you're doing for the fall, and I'm happy with our provost and president to answer any questions.
Thank you. So senators, if you have questions, you can post them in the chat or you can raise your hand, and you should be queued and I'll be able to call on you.
I have a quick questions for Rob.
So would you mind, just a second, would you mind stating your name and—
Assad Dawbari from Beckley campus.
Thank you.
The presentation regarding the budget, the question is it for only main campus or is for university system and including all the other campuses?
So this is our overall university budget.
The university system.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Are there questions that folks would like to ask orally? Okay, I've got a number of questions that have kind of been sent to me, so I'm just going to run down the list that I have. So the first question, thanks for these presentations. Heartened to see that our financial situation is not far off from last year's. This person who posed a question also says that she'll note it's expected that faculty have already been preparing to teach for online this fall. Notably, most faculty are on 9-month contracts. And I wonder if the university has considered small payments to faculty in preparing for moving online so that we can best ensure the most successful learning experience for concerned students and parents. I'll note that many institutions have done this: UIC, Maine, Emory, MSU, Denver. And this is a question that we've heard, not just from this particular senator, but from others as well, you know, regarding compensation, incentives and rewards for doing a lot of this extra work over the summer.
So there were, I think, 3 questions in there, Natalie. I can answer. I'll answer the last one because we've talked about this before. The reality is you saw the budget. We don't have a lot of, excess revenue to provide stipends for all the faculty who are going to be teaching online. One of the things we have provided a small amount of support to the academic units to distribute to faculty who were required to teach hybrid flex, because that takes a significantly larger amount of preparation. You're always teaching in 2 different modes. But remember, we had talked about this, I think, at our last faculty meeting. What we could do was to allow faculty to, again, change that percentage of their annual assignment so that they were at least rewarded for that additional, effort in teaching. We do know that faculty do research over the summer, as well as prepare for their classes. So while everybody's, while we're 9-month faculty, the reality is faculty work year round, because it's not, it's something that you have to prepare for in the fall. So, I mean, honestly, if we had those monies, we would distribute them and provide those stipends, but we don't.
The next question seems relatively uncomplicated. So when will campus open so that faculty can have access to their office and their materials in their offices? And then there's a second question that's related. Once you have a negative COVID-19 test, once your result comes in as negative, can you go back on campus?
Rob, do you want to answer those?
Sure. So there are folks who've already returned to campus, and the general rule is that if you have not returned to campus, I think your chairs and departments were supposed to work with you on return dates. So if you have not yet returned, at a minimum, Once you receive your negative test, you would be able to go back into your office to begin to work. But I would check with your chair of your department or your dean, as they may have specific times when they wanted folks to start to return to campus on that piece. I know for the non-academic side, we have people returning sort of in waves as they need to come back to campus for the fall. And so it's at a minimum when you get your negative back, but then depending on when you get that guidance from your chair dean that you can start to be back in work when you can. Okay,
thank you. Yep. This next question is about the calendar and how it's impacted now by that 1 week delay. They're asking specifically about midterms and finals. So are there any adjustments that need to be made there?
Oh, sorry about that. I'm looking at my notes here. No, the calendar doesn't change, only that what happens now is that there were 2 weeks that we had at the after Thanksgiving. One of those needs to be devoted to instruction, and then the last one will be a finals week. So we had a little more flexibility around that originally, but as far as I know, the schedule stays the same.
So the midterm date's the same, and
yeah, that's as far as I know, but I will check on midterms. I can tell you about the end of the semester. But as far as I know, everything is the same except for possibly midterms. Although, yeah, I mean, you have some flexibility in that, but I'll find out.
So the next question, President Gee's letter indicates that some in-person classes would be moved either online or changed to hybrid. Given that hybrid courses involve an in-person component while online classes do not, when will faculty know which modality they are teaching?
So what we have said, and we've talked to the deans, and they have agreed to this timeline, is that officially we should be able to have the schedule, the new schedule released by on or around August 5th, which is a week from tomorrow. So what I would say is, you know, as I had said earlier, that if you are teaching a non-skills based class that is upper division, the chances of you teaching that online are pretty strong, and you could start getting ready until you get official notice, or you could reach out directly to your chair.
Okay. Next, let's see, if you've requested and have gotten an ADA accommodation for the fall, do you need to go through the same process again for the spring? And relatedly, if you've been accepted for an ADA accommodation in both fall and spring, do you need to resubmit any medical records for the spring?
What I'm hearing is that you need to, you will need to reapply for spring if you haven't been approved for both semesters.
Oh, okay. So someone in submitting their accommodations would need to have been approved for both fall and spring. And there's a mechanism on the form for that?
I believe that there is. I'm looking for members of my team are texting me, but I believe that you actually could make that request for both semesters.
Okay. So next question, if your class is moved online in this new change, so you may have been teaching in person, is the class supposed to be asynchronous or is it supposed to be synchronous? And can classes keep their assigned times even if they're moved online?
Yeah, I can answer that. And I also I just got a note from my team, because they can't access the questions, that finals are the same. Midterm has moved. The adjusted calendar is coming this week.
Okay.
Okay. So to the question about synchronous, yes, absolutely. And in fact, if you can provide that synchronous experience, it's going to give students the feeling that they are actually in the classroom. It's a better way to engage them. So yes, you can keep the same class time. You can teach it synchronously, and we would encourage many faculty to include synchronous elements into their courses.
So faculty can include synchronous elements, but it's not a requirement. So if a class is moved online.
That's right. That's right. I mean, we sent some guidelines and expectations earlier our office did earlier this summer about what, ideally, what are those qualities for a good online course? And as well as TLC is going to repost their tips, and that is part of that, to have some synchronous instruction.